This is ContactTalkRadio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolutions Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, SHERI HORN HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on March 17th, 2022 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, before I begin with my Astro news you can use, I will go through my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled Podcast. From there, you can scroll down the page and hear the most recent show, either live, like right now, or recorded. And you can search the archive listings for past shows which you might have missed or to which you would like to listen again. Separately, please feel free to follow me on my Facebook page, which is called Karmic Evolution for Your Soul. Bear in mind there's a couple of different karmic evolutions, but mine has a sort of subtitle to it. So if you're confused, it's Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, and it has my picture on it. And that's where you can sign up for my Conversations About Consciousness newsletter as well. And finally, I'm still offering my 1-hour discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for listeners for only $99. And this reading is for those of you who are interested in astrology, want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart, because it essentially represents a snapshot of the exact position of the planets at the precise moment and location of your birth, and it acts as a kind of blueprint or soul map. So when it's used as a tool for soul growth, because it can reveal a great deal about you, a Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading can be tremendously helpful for learning about your soul's true purpose in this lifetime and how to move towards your highest destiny. It can reveal to you patterns of behavior that actually originated earlier in this lifetime or during past lives that may now be affecting your current relationships, your career decisions, your finances, and or your physical or mental health. But a reading can help you discover what these patterns of behavior are based on and how they may no longer serve you in your soul's karmic evolution moving forward. Our reading also provides you, a natal insight reading provides you with insights and information into what may have tripped you up in the past and how to entertain new perspectives so that you can gain greater awareness through astrological insight, which will bring greater happiness and satisfaction into your life in the future. Now, all of this is easy when you take advantage of my 1-hour discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $99. Simply email me at SHERI, that's SHERI, at Karmic Evolution, and we'll schedule your reading ASAP. At almost half the regular price, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. And now I want to mention that for the past 2 shows, I've notified people that I was going to be doing a Truth About Aries and Mars and the First House webinar, which is still planned, but the date has been changed, and it's more than likely not going to be live. It's going to be a downloadable webinar recording. So stay tuned for more on that. All right, so let's get on now to this week's Astro News you can use. And before we go forward to tomorrow's Virgo Full Moon, let's look back a bit. We might all remember now that the Pisces new moon of March 2nd asked us to plant compassionate seeds of empathy that bind us wholly to the suffering of others by imagining ourselves walking a mile in their shoes. Neptune ruled Pisces, also associated with the natural 12th house in our charts. For those of you who are unfamiliar, there is a natural zodiacal wheel which starts at 0 Aries, which means that the sign before Aries, which is Pisces, is the ruler, and it's not the sign that rules the house, it's a planet. So Neptune rules Pisces, and the two of them are synonymous, and together they are the rulers of the natural 12th house. And that represents, along with Neptune itself as a planet, and Pisces as its sign, as a sign of its rulership, is symbolic of collective energy. It's also symbolic of our inability to separate from collective energy, regardless of how emotionally independent from each other we think we are. Now that's a water sign, right? Water flows. There's no boundaries. So those who are empaths, I think, will understand what I mean, as it's often difficult for us to block out the energies of both other individuals and that of the general collective. And that's because our emotional and psychic energetic boundaries are porous. Again, water knows no boundaries. You know, if you pour water, right, or if you watch the ocean come up onto the shore, you know, there's no stopping point. It just goes according to the tides and the moon and all that. It's a feeling thing. So, in short, we feel others on more than simply the intellectual or rational logical level. And because we can feel them, often we bridge ourselves to them, either knowingly or unknowingly. So as the Pisces moon energy, the Pisces new moon energy back on March 2nd has been waxing over the past 2 weeks, we've all been bombarded with news like that of the Russian war on Ukraine and the multiple and horrendous casualties it's been causing to both those in the military and average, regular, normal civilians. And I'm not discounting the casualties on the Russian side either, in the form of their soldiers killed during their now 3+ week offensive to shut down a free, democratic, sovereign nation. Many of you may or may not know that, especially in the first and second weeks of the war, a lot of the young Russian soldiers who were captured as POWs by Ukrainians acknowledged that they were conscripts who did not know they were going to fight an actual war. In fact, they have recordings of telephone conversations between the soldiers and their mothers when the Ukrainians allowed them to make contact, where both parties were shocked to learn that the soldier himself and the mother or other relatives, that they had been called into battle. So, as our empathy increases, such empathy born of our compassion and sympathy for the suffering inherent in the collective right now, has infiltrated many of our psyches and left us, especially since Mercury entered watery Pisces March 9th and the Sun met Neptune in Pisces March 13th, feeling hopeless, helpless, fatigued, or depressed, and or motivated to help others in whatever ways we deem appropriate. I don't know about you guys, but I swear since last Friday, I have been ultra fatigued. I've spoken to many other friends and acquaintances who say the same thing. There's just this heaviness in the air, you know, this feeling of what can we do, what can we do? And that, you know, such helplessness or hopelessness makes us feel tired. depressed, or as I said, fatigued. So again, Russia's war against Ukraine becomes the perfect peg upon which to hang our greater understanding of current astrological energies as we move toward tomorrow's Virgo full moon. And that's because it occurred during a time when the Pisces new moon has some of us returning dreamily, or I should say unrealistically, to the glory days of our past in ways that might not be as healthy as we might have originally assumed. For example, I'll tell you a quick personal story. I got a call from a guy with whom I'd had a minor infatuation upon starting a new job, which was coincidental with my divorce nearly 20 years ago. Now, we've spoken a couple of times here and there, probably through Facebook or whatever, over the years, but we're not close at all. And he found a letter I'd written him, a kind of emotional letter at one point, and he came upon it recently after a breakup with his girlfriend of 2 years. And so he contacted me, and he wanted to meet, quote unquote, to talk. So, I was like, okay, this smacks of rebound energy. And I politely rebuffed him, and I was thinking, geez, I'm too old and, hopefully too wise at this point in my life to get sucked now back into the fantasy of a past that never fully materialized. But all of this came into my mind in part because I've been keeping track of what's been going on between Russia and Ukraine, because it's been so widely reported since the beginning of this war about Vladimir Putin's dream of returning to the past glory days of the Slavic Empire of which Ukraine was once a part. So I'm telling you this again because I'm asking everyone to please recognize how world and domestic events, of course, can mirror back to us the energies of the collective, but it's really up to us to see how these may be manifesting in our own individual lives. It's a matter of interpretation. I always say, the universe is benign and has no vested interest in making any of us suffer, but it provides us every moment of every day opportunities to grow in consciousness. However, it's up to us to choose to recognize those moments. So another interesting reflection of this wishful thinking energy as it relates to a long gone past can be seen domestically through the U.S. Congress, which, although they passed a $1.5 trillion budget bill on March 11th, and bear in mind Mercury went into Pisces on the 9th, and there was a Sun-Neptune meetup, which I talked about on the 13th. So they passed a $1.5 trillion budget bill on March 11th that funds the U.S. government through September, but also which dropped from the bill a provision which would have allotted $15.6 billion in coronavirus pandemic aid for future testing, therapeutics, vaccines, and efforts to stop new variants. And this was done as a new Omicron-related variant has begun to rear its ugly head in Europe, China, and other places around the globe. So my point here is that, there is an element since the Pisces new moon and the rest of the things that I mentioned, Mercury in Pisces, Sun Neptune, and we're going to come up to a Mercury-Neptune conjunction, which I'll talk about in a few. But that, we're still in this sort of la-la land. Like everybody is so hoping that this pandemic is now an endemic, which is something I talked about last week, and that, yes, we can all take off our masks because they've been proven to be negatively or adversely affecting our students, and our economics, through our businesses, et cetera, But it seems that there's no regard for looking to the future and to plan for what might occur. even if it isn't going to occur, right? So as last Sunday's March 13th Pisces Sun-Neptune meetup left us even more emotionally touched, or not. Some people have, are not empaths and they have a lot of blockage. As additional news kept pouring out of Ukraine about the targeting of maternity hospitals. I think I mentioned last week the mother was carried out on a stretcher. I think I said mattress, and I was like, it wasn't a mattress, it was a stretcher. That the very pregnant mother, she and her baby both subsequently died. And they're not the only ones. So there was news pouring out, deaths of mothers, babies, and children based on the Russian bombing, among others. This kind of tapping into collective grief, sorrow, pain, etc., apparently didn't extend to plans to continue to safeguard U.S. citizens from pandemic disease in the future. And I thought along the Neptunian line is interesting two things. One is that it was also reported earlier today that the U.S. Senate held a hearing on drug prices. I don't have the details on that, but clearly that's an issue related to Neptune. Neptune is drugs. It's alcohol, drugs, anything that affects the body and puts us into a escapist realm. It alleviates our pain. I'm not saying it as negative or positive. Obviously, we need drugs when we're in pain to quell our pain, but when we become addicted to them, it's another matter, right? So it's just that Neptune's in Pisces, as it has been, or will continue. It has been since 2010. It's usually there for about 14 years. So we're looking at 2014-15 before he moves on into Aries. And a lot has been revealed about the opioid crisis, etc. since then. But also we have this kind of flow of refugees and others that's going on right now. That's very Neptunian. But I wanted to mention also, back to the Ukraine, what's being called propaganda out of Russia, which is that they are accusing the United States of wanting to use chemical warfare against them. And most people see that, or most thinking people have seen that as a projection, that they're accusing someone else of doing exactly what it is that they want to do. But gas, now, I've mentioned this before, and it's an interesting point for those who study astrology, right? I'd mentioned that gas that comes, or oil that comes from underneath the earth, is something that a lot of astrologers attribute to Pluto, because it's found underneath the surface of the earth, and that's Pluto's domain. But gas, the kinds of gas that you can't see, that like if you're in your garage with the windows closed in your car and you're running the engine, or I don't know, maybe you have to open the windows, I'm not sure, I've never studied how to do that, you can commit suicide, right? Or you can accidentally expose yourself to carbon monoxide poisoning. So that is related, I think, to this conglomeration of Piscean energy right now, as well as to another issue, which I mentioned, but briefly, and I'll mention again later, which is propaganda. What Russia is doing is hugely propagandist. They're not the only ones. Do we have U.S. propaganda? Yes, of course we do. So again, I'm not making a judgment about it. I'm simply saying that it exists, and it has existed in more and more egregious fashion with the greater use of social media platforms, and especially since Neptune entered its own sign of Pisces at the end of the zodiac, circa 2010. All right. The other thing, if we go back to the Ukraine, are the reports about the walling off of certain Ukrainian cities, such as Mariupol, which is a city that lies closer to the south and in the direct path of Russia's military as it comes across its southern and western and eastern borders with Ukraine. And that, they have cut off electricity, the delivery of supplies such as food, water, and medicine, and that this in turn has also struck a chord with the collective, because it's horrified much of the world. It's inhumane, right, to deprive those who are injured of medicine, deprive regular people, especially children or pregnant mothers, again, not to belabor that, with food and water for survival. So, this has affected the entire world, aside from those who maybe preside over their own autocratic dictatorships and who agree with Putin's moves now. But this kind of thing is not only happening in Mariupol, it's happening in many cities across the Ukraine, including, of course, Kyiv, which is the capital. So again, while many of us were left feeling either hopeless or helpless at the Sun-Neptune conjunction this past weekend, others were moved to take action, such as donating to a charitable institution that helps refugees or food kitchens, feeding refugees. There's a nurturing component there, right? When you feel moved to help people, one of the ways you want to help is through nurturing them, and one of the basic ways we nurture people is through food. So, people are donating to food kitchens and other places that are feeding refugees, which are fleeing war on the border of Ukraine, over the border of Ukraine, in countries like Poland and Hungary and Romania and Slovakia, and private companies such as Airbnb, which have been taking both monetary and accrued credit card miles as donations to help house people in need right now. There's also the issue of foreigners buying plane tickets to border countries to Ukraine and then making their way across to aid their fight against Russia. Why? Well, for example, on March 7th, the day before Mercury entered Pisces, Reuters news service ran this headline: For foreign fighters, Ukraine offers purpose, camaraderie, and a cause. And their article continues, and I quote, Ukraine has established an international legion for people from abroad. Bear in mind, Mars and Venus are in Aquarius. And President Volodymyr Zelensky has publicly urged foreigners to, quote, fight side by side with Ukraine against the Russian war criminals, end quote, to show support for his country. Last week, Zelensky said that more than 16,000 foreigners had volunteered without specifying how many had arrived. Some foreign fighters arriving in Ukraine say they're attracted by the cause to halt what they view as an unprovoked attack in a once-in-a-generation showdown between forces of democracy and dictatorship. For others, many of them veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, the Ukraine war also offers a chance to use fighting skills they felt their own governments no longer appreciated. Now, that's a little bit of the Neptunian tendency to play the victim there, okay? Nobody likes me. I was trained to do this, now I can't do it. Okay, I'm not, forget it. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have said that in that way, but Neptune is related to both feeling victimized and also playing the martyr or the savior. So I think we see both of those in that. And I've read a couple articles and watched videos with interviews of some of these guys who went over to Ukraine. And, those especially who enlisted young in the U.S. military, because we have a voluntary army, primarily to have a secure job, a regular paycheck, and paid education. They're trained. This is from 18 or 19 or 20 to fight. And now they're kind of like, okay, so now I go back to my job at the factory, or now I go back to teaching, or now I go back to something else that doesn't really satisfy me, right? So they feel useless, or underappreciated or undervalued. That's my point too. And that can bleed into feeling a little bit victimized. So bear in mind that this particular piece that I just quoted from was published March 7th and refers to the week before. So we're talking about Pisces new moon energy. But moving into the present, earlier today on March 17th, we experienced Mercury in Pisces sextile to Uranus and Taurus, which provides opportunities to turn previously seemingly insolvable, particularly humanitarian threats, because it's Uranus, into challenges to which we now can find solutions, especially through the swift use of communication, technology, trade, etc. So I'm going to delineate that in a second, but since Ukrainian President Zelensky's addresses to the Canadian, UK, and US parliaments and Congress over the past week, and most notably his address to the U.S. Congress yesterday, March 16th, as this energy waxed strongest, the U.S. pledged $800 million more in weapons for Ukraine. In fact, following Zelensky's morning speech yesterday, according to the New York Times, and here again I quote, President Biden announced $800 million in new military aid for Ukraine, including 800 additional Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, 9,000 anti-tank weapons, 100 tactical drones, and a range of small arms, including machine guns and grenade launchers. Quote, the Ukrainians have already proved their prowess at using British-provided and American-made anti-tank weaponry against Russia's much larger military. And this is again from the New York Times. But in an impassioned speech to Congress on Wednesday, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine asked for additional help as the Russian troops pushed to encircle major cities. U.S. and European officials want to send more equipment that's easy to use by small teams and that has technology that can overcome Russian defenses or exploit weaknesses, rather than offensive weapons like tanks and warplanes that require significant logistical support, end quote. So note that this is on top of the March 11th budget legislation passed by the U.S. Congress to provide a total of $13.6 billion in Ukrainian aid, and that's $6.5 billion to the Pentagon for military assistance and $6.7 billion to care for refugees. So the extra $800 million granted yesterday is for smaller, more easily transportable Mercury in Pisces, anyone? Weapons that include flying drones and other things that are used on the ground that can be shot out at. So Uranus, anyone, of something that flies through the air, or Ukrainian ground troops in local areas. Again, Mercury. And this seems to correspond, at least in part, to, again, this particular aspect in the sky. And this leads us again to tomorrow's Virgo full moon, when the Virgo moon opposes the Pisces sun at 27 degrees and 40 minutes from this Mercury-ruled sign at 12:18 a.m. Pacific time and 3:18 a.m. Eastern time on tomorrow, March 18th. So that's in the early morning, right? Hang on one second, guys. Sorry about that. So this full moon in the sign of health, service, and our daily routine, sometimes as it relates to work that we get paid for and other times just to our work, asks us to release any unrealistic dreams about returning to the glory days of our past and to move forward more realistically and practically by understanding the factual truth now. And one of the ways we can do this, is through the use of ritual, because it's ritual that keeps us focused and able to avoid being drowned by Piscean tidal waves of emotion that can threaten to drive us mad. In other words, the Virgoan earthier tendencies toward precision, accuracy, conciseness, context, and fact help ward off the unconscious fear of Pisces getting lost in a sea of emotion and drowning in the grief, sorrow, anger, or rage of the collective. I'll point out, too, that now and for the past couple of lunations, I meant to mention this and then for whatever reason have neglected, there is, when we look at the major planets only and we don't count angles of a specific location, there's a lack of fire in the sky. And a lack of fire, which is known as inferior function in Jungian psychological terms, something I'm going to get into in a few minutes because I want to talk a little bit about Zelensky's chart and his lack of water. An inferior function means that it erupts from below at times of stress or crisis. So fire is, inspiration, right? So on the positive side, it gives us the impetus to move, to do something, to fight for ourselves, to be our individual selves or whatever. We've got Leo and Aries and Sagittarius as our fire signs in that fire element. When we lack fire, however, we may go into a rage, and that happens only periodically. But because the lunations reflect back to us the energies of the collective, a lack of fire in the sky can manifest as rage in the collective, right? It can also manifest to a certain extent through mania or manic outpourings of emotion or actions. I think a good example of that would be something like the people who, I'm thinking of the trucker convoy, that was up in Ottawa in Canada and unsuccessfully tried to get into Washington, D.C. a week or two ago, that people were moved to take some kind of action out of anger. Of course, we've seen it for a long time over the coronavirus vaccine and or mask mandates and in the school system and all of that. So, but again, Virgo energy represents sort of warding off getting lost or drowned in the sea of Piscean emotional energy through engaging in regular rituals. And so empaths who understand this use ritual to stay sane by blocking what might otherwise become, again, a rising tide of grief or helplessness or fatigue or depression due to the unfathomable depths of sadness of the world. And today, astrologer Mitchell Lewis, who many of you know I've had on this show a good number of times before, posted this about the Virgo full moon, which I thought everybody should hear, and I'm quoting now. This will be a watershed moment that will define this current lunar cycle and the coming months more than most full moons. This is a time of sickness and healing, of confusion and clarity. The energy of Virgo and Pisces represent the polarity of the illness and the healer. Where Virgo tends to be overly critical and detail-oriented, Pisces tends to be amorphic and undefined, existing on an ethereal plane without substance. That is one of the problems the world is facing now. Where is our solid footing? Are we standing on hard ground or quicksand? And here I would point out, use the Ukrainian example again. It's like refugees. Are we on hard ground? We're moving, we're flowing. We can't stay on this hard ground. We have to move some more. It's turning into quicksand. Just a couple of pictures of the bombing of apartments and hospitals and the rest show you that what was once there is now gone. Now that kind of PTSD is Uranus and Aquarius related, but it's like the ground is disappearing underneath your feet. But that's what causes you to have to shift, right? So is this place safe or is that place safe? So back to Mitchell's writing. He says, what should we believe in and how best can we achieve our purpose With the problems the world is facing, war escalation, financial instability, he's a financial astrologer talking about the markets, and ongoing struggles of consciousness and definition, we can add that potential health crisis that millions of refugees seeking shelter, food, and health care may create. The Ukrainian situation truly is a worldwide event, as Zelensky said in his speech to Congress. It can't be ignored or swept under the rug. And that gives me validation for having focused on it so heavily in the last couple of weeks. Anyway, quoting again, this is something we must face on a global scale. It will force us to change the way the world makes decisions and to reevaluate our standards morally and ethically. That is what the Virgo Pisces energy implies. And this full moon has come, as they all do, exactly on time. He adds also, if there's a physical problem in your body, it may come to the surface now. This often happens on full moons, but especially on the Virgo Pisces axis. Don't ignore symptoms. Pay attention to anything your body is telling you. Use caution with alcohol and drugs, legal or illegal, and do what you can to help those around you. This can be a very trying few days when those in need are most vulnerable. Do what you can to help, but keep an eye on your own physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. If you get drawn into someone else's issues and can't find your own path, what good are you to anyone? End quote. And I would add that engaging in meditation, engaging in prayer, engaging in artistic endeavors, dance, fine arts, music. I noticed through some news clips I've seen over the last 2 weeks too, as people in Ukraine have been drawn into these underground bunkers, whether it's a subway station, whether it's a basement of a building, those who have artistic talent brought their instruments and they've been playing music, and there's something so empathic about that. Right? Here we are in the worst of times, but yet we can all collectively, I don't know what words to use, we can all join together to feel the music, right? And that gives us comfort because it allows us catharsis, which is something I talked about a few weeks ago, to express our emotions and the things that are trying us right now, the sorrow, the grief, the anger. So what Mitchell has said, I think makes the message of this Virgo full moon perhaps easier to take because we're aided by the Virgo moon's earthy trine to the transiting karmic Taurus North Node, which can provide an easy route to staying grounded, and by the moon's sextile to the transiting. Likewise, the Pisces sun at this lunation forms a watery trine to the Scorpio South Node, which also paves an easier way for us to intuit what that previously hidden truth about others might be, while the Pisces sun is sextile to the Taurus North Node, and that allows us to take advantage of intuiting our way towards grounding the concepts of peace, harmony, and serenity. Also, we better relate to and voice the world's collective pain, sorrow, and grief when Venus in Aquarius sextiles wounded healer Chiron in Aries on March 18th, which is just after the full moon. So this aspect's energies are followed by the Sun-Pluto sextile in Capricorn then too, which may well provide opportunities for deeper introspection about how to realign our personal goals and intentions with those of the collective. And that's, again, in large part where I think Mitchell Lewis uses the terminology he does in saying that this is a really important lunation. Now, when Venus squares Uranus on March 19th, impatience with the lack of freedom and or flexibility may result in arguments that lead to sudden breaks in our relationships. I mean, everyone needs space to be who they are as an individual. But this time also can present us with a favorable one for clearing the air by expressing our needs in ways that can lead to a better understanding in current partnerships. Whether or not that bodes well for peace talks that are ongoing right now between the Russians and Ukrainians, I don't know. But there's more to follow. So the energy begins to shift when the sun enters martially motivated Aries on March 20th. And this marks also the Northern Hemisphere's spring equinox. This shift in tone moves us further towards taking actions that ensure our attempts to make our own choices brook no intervention right now. You know, Aries is action. Aries is the baby of the zodiac, you know, it rushes in. It doesn't think about the repercussions. It just acts on instinct, which is why spring and the ingress of the sun into Aries in Western tropical astrology is traditionally the time of new birth. It's also time to plant seeds, which is a little ironic as it comes after the Virgo Full Moon, which wants us to release, right? But it's coincidentally or ironically a time to plant seeds that will be harvestable in about 6 months in the fall. So if we reap what we sow, then, as the proverb goes, we may well spend some time contemplating our ability to give birth to something or someone new now, right? Plant the seeds, give birth down the line. Now the moon, newly in Scorpio at this March 20th spring equinox, it'll have moved on from Virgo, obviously, quincunxes the Aries sun on March 20th as it moves from dreamy, unrealistic, uber empathic, but meditative and artistic Pisces into the more ambitious, motivated, and assertive Aries. So in short, it's time to make the adjustment between our hearts and our minds and to recharge our batteries now as daylight lengthens and brings with it a greater sense of freedom of choice, stemming first and foremost from our choice to be born and secondly to remain alive. I'll mention also that the Senate, I think it was, passed a bill to do away with daylight savings time here in the U.S. It hasn't passed the House yet, and there's a lot of differing opinions about that. So it's very interesting because, you know, it's happening just after we push the clocks forward on March 13th here, 13th, 14th, whatever it is. And we go back and forth between, you know, daylight savings time and regular time. So there's a lot of different arguments about whether this is a positive or negative thing, but it's interesting that the bill has come up in Congress at this particular point in time, almost as if perhaps they planned it, right? Now, in terms of our freedom of choice, right, I have said before the Aries archetype is about being born. We signal to the mother in utero. The fetus says, I'm ready. And it's not a thinking thing. It doesn't sit there contemplating, gee, is it Tuesday? I think I'd like to be born on a Tuesday. Rather, something happens, the chemicals shift, and boom, labor starts. And once we're alive, we get to decide if we'd like to remain that way. Now, this is especially true given the Mercury-Jupiter conjunction in Pisces, which follows later that day or early March 21st, depending on your time zone, which allows us to intuit and better understand a wider view of the bigger picture and to take fortuitous actions, particularly in the realm of business, as long as we're cautiously mindful enough not to overlook seemingly minor or irrelevant details. So while we may be able to comprehend the larger view and to plan accordingly, while also being more tolerant of other people's viewpoints, still we'll want to watch for overconfidence that leads to sloppy thinking now. Remember, Jupiter magnifies our thoughts when Mercury and Jupiter come together. And it's, you know, hyperbole and exaggeration, Mercury, communication, Jupiter, right? We're going to, you know, and optimism. I mean, there may be statements made all over the world, but particularly out of Russia and or Ukraine, and we're winning, no, we're winning, no, I'm winning, no, you're winning, oh, okay, whatever. So, again, this becomes more important because we continue to grapple with the Neptunian themes of confusion, illusion, and delusion right now that this combination can also cause, because, you know, we're trying to move from imagining this better future to becoming, well, the point here is what I'm trying to make is that the Piscean energy of these past 2 weeks and before that, because Neptune is so associated with confusion, illusion, and delusion, that we may get stuck in imagining this fantasy future to the point where we become delusional about what's actually possible right now. So propaganda, misinformation, disinformation still abound, and it's the Virgo full moon that asks us to release all that we cannot prove is factually true. So accepting propaganda and lies as truth becomes the low side manifestation of this energy. The high side is that it's a wonderful time for creative expression concerning the arts, as I mentioned before, as well as for receiving our creative spark through such ritualistic endeavors, which I mentioned before too, prayer, meditation, rhythmic physical movements such as dance, yoga, tai chi, etc. Given the fact that the sun will then be in Aries, which wants to express itself in part through physical movement. Now, Mars in Aquarius sextiles wounded healer Chiron March 21st also, and we may see more vociferously vocal outcries about wounding of all kinds between now and then. However, this will be best identified through the situation again in Ukraine right now, as more and more countries, groups such as the UN, the International Court of Justice, which is investigating whether or not Russia has committed war crimes, corporations and individuals speak out about the pain and suffering of others. So this may include the suffering of average Russian citizens too, who have no interest in a war with their literal or ancestral relatives in Ukraine. And Mars continues in Venus's footsteps when he squares Uranus March 23rd, which is when restless impulsivity over the lack of freedom may come to a head. On a personal level, we may use this energy to institute creative change in our lives, or else we run the risk of rebelling in ways that cause us to throw the baby out with the bathwater or cut our nose off to spite our face, as they say, which is really kind of to say knee-jerk rebellion. As for the current global situation, some kind of sudden explosive incident is potentially likely because this energy represents having waited too long to make those creative changes. Whether average citizens will rebel, as in the case of the Russian TV editor that Zelensky praised recently for, quote, telling the truth after she was arrested for holding up a sign on Russian state television saying no war and saying that the Russian people were being lied to, or whether Putin will rebel even more as he feels increasingly cornered by the mess he's gotten himself into, remains to be seen. However, as Zelensky noted about Russia, they can't put us all in prison. So I wanted to talk for my remaining few minutes about the fact that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has only one planet in water, which is Uranus and Scorpio. I mentioned this briefly a week or two ago. But Uranus is an outer planet, and at its heart it represents our ability to individuate, which is to say throw off our former or prior ego conditioning, which means beliefs, and to become the individual we actually incarnated in this lifetime to be. Now, what's interesting is that he also has the Sun conjunct Venus in Aquarius, which is in modern astrology ruled by Uranus. So his Sun is ruled by Uranus, and Uranus is his only planet in water, and Uranus represents, among other things that I just mentioned, it represents groups, right, and legislatures. So his lack of water is what Carl Jung termed inferior function, meaning it lies below his consciously dominant function, which is in his case is both fixed fire and fixed air. So fixed fire equals Leo, which is a creative archetype that often loves to perform. Bolstering this is the fact that he's got a Leo moon, and often that's a signature of one who feels secure when they are noticed and appreciated. Clearly, he was a performer prior to becoming president. And he's been engaged in performances, quote unquote, and I don't say that in a derogatory way, as he's been addressing these different legislative bodies asking for more help for Ukraine. So, the fact that one carries inferior function, and not all of us do, or not all of us do, we can't see it with everyone. It just depends on your natal chart. It's that water, which represents emotion, lies underneath the dominant function. He's aware that he's Leonine. He's aware that he's Aquarian, right, on some level. He may not know astrology, but he would use words that would easily place him in those categories, and has done so. So a lack of an element tends to rise into consciousness during crisis or stressful periods. And with Zelensky, what's interesting is that a lack of water might manifest in some people as their inability to feel, to express emotions, but to nonetheless feel them on a very, very deep level. And I think I mentioned this previously, that many of the world's greatest musicians and artists and dancers have the ability to evoke emotion in others, but they themselves do not display emotion very easily. And this, whether the latter is true or not with Zelensky, what I'm trying to refer to is that, and I'm going to read here for some of the things I cut and pasted. I mean, on March 8th, the day before Mercury entered Pisces, well, first on March 1st, Ukrainian President Zelensky received a lengthy standing ovation after delivering an emotional speech via video to the European Parliament, calling for Ukraine to be granted membership to the European Union. On March, now he's rescinded that, I think, but that's part of their peace discussion. So, whether or not they go forward with that is not clear. But on March 8th, he was given a standing ovation from lawmakers in the British House of Commons at the beginning and end of the speech delivered by video link. And he told British lawmakers that the question facing his country was to be or not to be, quoting Shakespeare, after Russia's invasion, and he repeated his calls for more help, including tougher sanctions against Moscow. And now also yesterday, he addressed the U.S. Congress and was met with a standing ovation there. And one of the quotes that I heard U.S. House of Representatives, Representative Gregory Meeks, who's a Democrat from New York, say on television was, and I quote, "I don't think you can be human and not feel his words." So this is my point, that Zelensky, whether he himself feels able to express emotions in his everyday, average, normal life, and it would seem that he does, but, so whether that applies to him or not, I'm not sure, but I don't know the man personally. He definitely has the capability to trigger deep feelings in others, which come out of his unconscious, right? So he feels things very deeply and has the capability to create catharsis with his audience. So that's all that I really wanted to say about that, because I think it's so important to recognize how much water is affecting what's going on right now, given the circumstances. As Mitchell Lewis said, well, the Virgo moon is right on time, as all lunations are. It's no accident. It's a synchronicity that it is Zelensky in power right now, while there's been so much water in the sky. And over the past 3 weeks, we've seen almost 3 million refugees, or 3 million Ukrainian citizens become refugees by having to flow across borders. Right? We saw the same thing during the Syrian invasion of Russia, when it aided the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Bashar. I'm sorry, I don't want to say his name because I'm going to get it wrong, but I think you guys know who I'm talking about. The flow of refugees, but in that case, into the water. Right? How many different news pieces do we see of entire floatable boats or rafts or whatever you want to call them being overturned and the people drowning and losing their lives? This is not as related to water, but it's a flow over land, but it's a flow regardless, right? And what we're trying to do is flow weaponry and other things to aid the Ukrainians across borders, because NATO and the United States cannot go there themselves or represent themselves in Ukraine, because that would trigger a world war. That is what is being said, right? The no-fly zone won't be violated. They won't do a no-fly zone, which we've talked about before, because it would be deemed by Russia to be an action against which they could retaliate against the U.S., against NATO countries, and against some of the countries that are not NATO countries, but are Eastern European countries like Georgia and Slovakia and Moldavia that have been created as independent units since the dissolution of the Soviet Empire in 1991. So I just wanted to point all of that out, and I hope that it's made sense, and that, you guys have learned a little bit more, again, about how these current energies in the sky definitely can be relatable to us on a more personal level, because as above, so below, right? So I want to thank everyone for joining me today, and hang on, I'm just getting back to my place where I have my little ending remarks, because I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week, March 24th, when I will be joined by Lynn Coiner. I mistakenly said last week, for those of you who are waiting for her to show up, that she was going to be this week, but that was my mistake, so I apologize. So Lynn Coiner is going to be on the show next week, and she is always an interesting and information-filled font, because she's a font of information. So please join us then. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come